Hello and welcome to another episode of Who Knew in the Moment podcast. I'm your host, Phil Friedrich, and today I'm honored to have Chris Senkbile with me. He is a VP over at UNICO, and he's also the founder of Ferro. And one of the things I think you're going to learn about his story is when you have a strong work ethic, not having all the answers is not a barrier to entry. So, Chris, thanks so much for being on, brother.
Hey man, good to be here. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
You betcha. So to start off with your story, and we were kind of chatting about it just a minute ago, growing up in Midwest Nebraska, I think there's just an element of work ethic that can come, from that demographic or that region. So talk a little bit about, the early years and, how the work ethic was formed.
Yeah, man. I'm a farm boy. Started working, I think, 8-hour days at about age 5, and and then just have never ever stopped. It's the expectation, on the farm. Everybody pitches in, and I think we joke, but I think I started driving a stick shift at age 6 all around the countryside out there because you're an extra hand, right? So get to work and figure it out, and that was the expectation. The only thing we got off work for, and this was, my dad was really good about this, was for athletics. So if we had a practice or a game or weights, he always made sure we could make it there. So we kind of had this decision to make, like, listen, if I don't want to be working, which I didn't, I'm going to get in as many sports as I possibly can, right? And I'm going to go to every weight, I'm going to go to every like early bird. I'm going to hit everything I can so I cannot work. So, but I think to your point, like, there's a tremendous blessing that comes with that, that upbringing that you don't necessarily appreciate at the time, which is, broad shoulders just kind of come part and parcel with that, and you just like, you're working 8-hour days on the farm, and then you're going to go hit a baseball game, or you're going to go, lift at the gym for 2 hours that night, and I remember a lot of summers coming home and like, you're eating dinner at like 9:30, 10 after like literally like an 18-hour day, and then you wake up and do it all over again. So yeah, super blessed to just kind of have that ingrained in sort of my being to some degree. And I know, as I try and raise my kids now, because I've got 3, and it's like, how do I instill that in them? Because I want them to have that blessing of like grit and drive and work ethic, and it's not easy actually. So I'm again very blessed, thankful to my folks for doing that for me.
Yeah, well, and something you hit on there was the sports aspect. And so, sports became a, important part of your life, and football especially became kind of the, catalyst and end up pursuing college. But one thing I'm always curious about, was that a life goal? Was it, hey, after a certain game or a certain season, I felt like, wow, I'm actually good enough to go do that? Or what did that look like for you?
You know what? I didn't think anything else other than I'm doing sports and I'm going to take this as far as I possibly can. I think that's, one of the pros and cons of my upbringing too, is like my dad just instilled in us, like, you work hard enough, you can do anything in life. He didn't tell me that I was a 5'10" slow, skinny white boy like that. I forgot to kind of like mention, that part of the equation. So in my mind, I'm like, well, like NFL, man, like I can do it because I'm going to work hard and get there. And then, you get to college and, you have some success there, but you kind of realize, like, you know what, like, I'm not different in the way you need to be different to go to the next level, So, yeah, that's certainly was very much like my focus was taking it as far as I could and working as hard as I could to take it that far. And then you kind of get to a point, like I said, where you kind of have that realization of like, yeah, you know what, like, it's been a good run, but we've probably maxed out the potential on the ceiling there. So
Yeah. Well, so one thing I always think is interesting is, people that play athletics in general, but especially once you get to the college level, there's certain leadership principles that you either get exposed to and you're like, wow, I really would like to adopt that someday, whether that's as a parent or in my business. And then there's other leadership styles that you see and you're like, I hope I never have to deal with this again. So, were there any, coaches or leaders on your team that, you really bought into their system, or, maybe vice versa. People you're like, I hope this never is a part of, my future.
Yeah, isn't life interesting that way? Yeah, I would say my high school football coach Tomlin, shout out to Coach T, still coaching at Grand Island Senior High, and does a tremendous job out there. But just he instilled a concept for me that I found at the time, like, probably didn't appreciate as much as I do now, but he called it Go 11. And Go
Mm.
11 meant uh, as a team, we are moving in a common direction, right? A common goal, and we're doing it together, all 11 guys on the field. And
Yeah.
I think that as I've gotten older, I've learned to appreciate that more. Just to understand that, listen, I can drive and run as hard as I want on my own, but if I'm not bringing people with me, right, as I do that, one, it's not fulfilling. Two,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna go near as far. And so really leaning on, friendships, on counterparts, to help develop, grow myself, and in turn, iron sharpens iron kind of concept there. So that's probably the one that really stuck with me the most. And then, yeah, you have other experiences, with other coaches along the way where, maybe they're not as, uplifting as you would hope. And you learn from those in the same way, right? Like you learn in the same
Yeah.
way. I don't want to be that kind of leader that elicits that sort of response from the people I'm leading or engaging with. So yeah, certainly, like, the athletics, I think, the team concept, working with others, conflict, all that, and then just the leadership that you kind of learn as a part of being in all that is, I think, again, just a tremendous blessing to take forward later in life, for sure. So, and I'm sure you can relate to some degree.
Yes, sir. Yeah. I always say role models can be one of two things, either people you'd like to emulate or people that you never want to be like, right? Both are still a role model if you look up the definition. So,
Yep, you nailed it, buddy. You nailed it.
now, as you're graduating, once again, hey, it's time to be done with school. And like many, people that graduate college, it's like, well, I don't have like this crystal clear ball of exactly what I want to do. So you enter into banking. And along the way, though, your passion for basketball, you keep playing basketball and some pickup games. And so that's start stirring a conversation for a certain company. So talk about how that all came to be.
Yeah. Yeah, what's funny is the not knowing. My nephew, who's turning 16, was just visiting from LA a couple weeks ago, and we were kind of talking about that, like, what's your why, right? Like,
Yeah.
what do you want to, even at that age, like, start driving for? And at 16, you don't have a clue. Like, you have some ideas, right? But you don't have a clue. And I think
Yeah.
I was very much the same way. I'm like, I just want to go and do and be successful. Like, my
Yeah.
personality is like optimizer, maximizer. Like, I just want to get the most out of whatever I'm doing. And I think the early days coming out of school, like, I just identified, like, what, this isn't gonna be fulfilling for me in any way, shape, or form. And really what I wanted was autonomy. I wanted three things. I wanted autonomy, I wanted recurring revenue, and I
Hmm.
wanted ownership. I didn't know
Yeah.
how I was going to get those things, but that's what I wanted to get to, right? And yeah,
Yeah.
so when I wasn't traveling, I'd play noon ball and started playing pickup ball, and 2 or 3 times a week over the lunch hour. And you start doing that over time, and you start to get to know the guys you're running with or whatever. And a couple of the guys said, "Hey, have you ever thought about getting into insurance?" And I was like, no, like,
No.
I never thought about it once. And they're like, well, you should come sit down and, like, learn a little bit more about what the independent brokerage world looks like what our firm looks like. And at the end of the day, it was an opportunity to check all three of the boxes that I wanted to check in a fairly low risk sort of environment, because you've got the backdrop of the firm to support you versus going out and starting something on your own, right?
Yeah.
And so it was just a great fit that way. I had a small family, and yeah, got in and started running hard at the brokerage, and just been a tremendous opportunity with a group of good guys to go 11, work towards the top common goal
Yeah.
of brokerage. And And we have, and I'm 9 years in now. I think we were about $19 million in revenue, and I think we're 33 million, and have sites to keep moving. So it doesn't happen easy. It doesn't happen overnight. But I was thinking, actually, one of my employees sent me a text last night on the compounding effect. And it was like so timely, right? It's just that you're probably familiar with Ed Millett, like Power of One, right? But just wake up, like one more phone call, one more conversation, one more day, right? And eventually that that compounding effect eventually is going to kind of like hockey stick a little bit. And I think that's the way I look at it. Day-to-day life is, just wake up and keep fighting, man. Like one more, that's all you got to do.
Yes. Well, and so something that I want to highlight in that is it's not like things weren't going well for you in, banking or then in the franchise or, selling. It's like things were going well, but you were still open to opportunity. And I think, you and I are both young, but like reflecting on like younger years, and that is, man, like saying yes just creates so many opportunities that you may not have ever otherwise explored. So maybe talking to saying yes in the younger years, but now something that I'm struggling with as I get older is saying yes to the right things instead of saying yes to everything. And it's like, but it served me so well to say yes to everything for the last decade. But unfortunately, to get to where I want to go for the next decade, saying yes to everything actually is a prohibitor because it's like I'm spending time in the wrong circles or in the wrong events. So talk about kind of those two different dynamics.
Yeah. Our mantra for the startup for Ferro this year is ferociously focused at Ferro. And really what that means is we can't say yes to every request that comes in. Hey, could you guys do this? Or make this for us, right? And I think there's a lot to be said for, again, that compounding effect. It's got to be focused, right? It can't be shotgun approach in a ton of different areas, because then I've tried that early on in my career. Like I tried, you and I were talking before we jumped on here, hey, I'm going to focus, in all these different sort of industries or areas or whatever. I'm going to go, an inch deep, a mile wide. Well, that's not really going to pay off because, as you know, in life, 90% of it is relationship driven. And if you can go a mile deep and an inch wide, you're going to get a lot more out of that than you are, with the other approach. So I think as I've gotten older and further into the career, like it really does come down to staying focused on kind of what your North Star is, like in understanding your why, right? Like, why am I doing this? What is like my end game? And does this thing that just came in as an option support me heading towards that end game? Yes or no? And try and like create that mental framework to run it through. I think it makes it pretty simple then, right? To say yes or no if it does or doesn't support where you're ultimately trying to go. And it's tough, right? Because like you got friends who ask you or whatever, and you're like, oh, I want to help, or you got, partners who, or maybe you're like, oh gosh, it could be a good investment, or all these different things that kind of come your way. And it can still be tough, but I think establishing that framework to run it through, like understanding where you're going, and in that, it's really hard not to get caught up on like what everybody else is doing, and I think you got to just stay focused on like, hey, for me, this is what I can do. This is where I'm going. It's great that all these other things are going on for other people, but for me, this is my track, and I'm going to keep running on it.
Yeah. So how does Chris dilute the noise of the FOMO?
Oh man, you know what? Probably not as well as I should. But I do think for me, like I have a pretty consistent vision. I was meeting with kind of a counselor, life coach, and they gave me this analogy of a bus, a city bus, and I'm the driver. And again, it's just another way to think of that mental framework, right? She had me pick 5 of my what we called my core values. Okay. She said, throw those core values up on the ticker of the bus, right? That's where the next destination is, this core value, right? She said,
Yeah.
okay, so if something gets on the bus that doesn't support that core value where you're heading, what are you going to do? Kick it off the bus, right?
Yeah.
And it's just a way for me, again, another mental framework to think about that. And so, there's things that support my core values that maybe are a little bit of a distraction for my business values, right? But I
Yeah.
still want to do them because they support my core values. So I think it really just comes down to like sitting down personally and thinking about, okay, what are my core values? What am I working towards? There's certainly the monetary financial thing, but guess what?
Yeah.
That's not number one for me.
Yeah.
Like, it's not number one. That, faith, family, those things are number one for me. So there's other things that come on the bus that support those core values. Like, let's engage them and figure out how to like divide myself enough to be able to accomplish all of it and keep the bus moving down the road, right?
Yeah. I love that. That's a great framework to look at. Now, as you're starting off in UNICO and you're having some success as a producer in that industry at the time, if you hit certain levels of production, you would get invited on a trip. And so you end up taking a certain trip and meeting a certain somebody. So talk a little bit about how this comes to be on the trip.
Oh yeah, you must have talked to Clara. Yeah, so I was single, and it's we call it our President's Club trip, and
Yeah.
it's like all the guys, my partners at the firm and their spouses, and then the single guy on the trip. And yeah, long story short, we met Clara's best friend and her husband, Anna and Chris, on the trip and at our resort. And Anna, kind of hit it off with our group, and they were chatting, and I was, I don't know, floating on a unicorn shooting baskets in the pool or something. And they all worked out to bring, Clara just happened to be vacationing at the same time, like 20 miles south, just pure happenstance. And they all worked out. Anna was going to tell Clara, hey, come up to the resort the next day and just hang out. We'll pay for your day or whatever. And so I'm kind of like, no idea what's going on. And Chris, the was Anna's husband's name. Chris came over the next morning and said, hey, stop by, hang out. We got the cabana rented out or whatever for the day. And I said, sure, I'll pop over. You guys were, super nice yesterday. And so I went over and said, oh, hey, by the way, this is our friend Clara. And I just kind of had one of those moments of like, oh, I already know this is going to be a thing. Like, I took one look at the girl. I'm like, this is going to be a thing, And it did. So we hung out for the day, and she had to leave and head back to her spot. And she said, well, should we exchange phone numbers? She's from Toronto. And I said, yeah, I guess we could exchange phone numbers. Like, sure, thinking nothing was going to come of it. And a year
Yeah.
later, we were married. So
I love it, brother. I love it.
yeah, very
Now,
blessed, very blessed.
yeah, well, and now, just in that regard, and obviously we're going to talk about, the starting of a new business, but, so many people talk about the person that end up with is going to be a big dictator of, how far you can go and, the, level of success you can have because, let's be honest, we all know people where, hey, the spouse is not super supportive of, long hours. They're not super supportive of taking a risk because, well,
Yeah.
what happens if it doesn't work out? I mean, does that mean our family doesn't get to take a family vacation, right? I mean, all those different things. And so making sure you're aligned with, amount of time, energy, effort, and risk that can go into something. So talk a little bit about your guys' partnership dynamic there when it comes to the business side of things.
So I couldn't agree with you more on the spousal kind of component there. I think it is as big a component of success as anything, right? If you're spending all your time on a tough relationship or trying to and you can't focus on trying to build that legacy or whatever your kind of why or your bus kicker is, it's distracting, right? It consumes your energy. Best thing about Clara, so I had been kind of stewing on this startup idea for a while, hadn't mentioned it to her. Finally, one Friday, I'm on my way home from work. We had to fly out to Miami the next morning. And I called her and I said, hey, I got this thing. I cannot get it out of my head. Like I can't, like it, I have to do something with it. It's consuming me. Like I have to do this thing. What do you think? And verbatim, she goes, ride or die, dude, let's go. And like, that's like, that is so powerful, right? To have that
Yeah.
support, knowing took 3 words, right? Ride or die. And I felt entirely empowered and commissioned by her, supported by her to go and start it. So we hit Miami. We were supposed to be on vacation, and I spent the entire vacation working, like feeling the freedom now to like take what was out in my head and like get it out and start working on it. And so we were down there. She was poolside, and I and I was working, and she was cool with it, right? She was cool
Yeah.
with it. So,
Well, so I love that because it is so important. Now, the flip side is, right, it's important to give time, energy, and attention to the important relationships in your life, right? So there is that element of, hey, if you did that all day, every day, she probably wouldn't love that, so you have to be intentional of, all right, I need to turn it off for a little bit and make sure that, I'm filling up her cup in the way that she needs it filled. So, talk about that the flip side of the balancing act, right? And how can make sure you're being intentional with your time, energy, and effort towards, a spouse or a partner in a
yeah,
relationship.
man, people don't tell you that, like, like startup world, like, kind of like sexy or whatever. They don't tell you how much strain it actually does put on a relationship. And it does. Like, I'll be dead honest with you. It does put strain on a relationship, because even if I'm present, right, physically, mental presence is
Yeah.
still sometimes a hard thing to have when your mind is working on, a lot of different, components. And so I would say, like, God's honest truth, like it does create stress in the relationship. Um, just because of, when I'm done with work, on the clock,
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily mean I'm done with work up here. And so, she's been really good. The one thing about Claire that's like a huge blessing is she will just say it. Like, there's no like passive aggressive behavior. She'll just be like, so uh like, you want to be here right now? Like, what are you doing, dude? Which is awesome, because I'm
Yeah.
like a super, typically like a pretty like uh well, I don't even know what the right word is. Like, I'm quick to apologize. Like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, like, I'm so sorry. You're right. Okay, I'm here. Like, let's do whatever it is we're doing. But I think the intentionality, and you probably hear this all the time, but like the intentionality just becomes even that much more important, because you're balancing the startup, the day job, kids, all those different things. And so just finding those moments, that doesn't have to be a lot, right? But where you can just sit down, you're not talking about anything other than the two of you, what
Yeah.
your passions are together, what you want to accomplish together, right? What drives her. And that's an hour and a half date night, once a week, or coffee or brunch, or whatever. So I think the intentionality just becomes that much more important. And it doesn't matter. Any relationship requires intentionality. I just think it
Yeah.
becomes even more emphasized when you're kind of in that startup realm that can absolutely consume you. So
Absolutely. So talking about, getting into the startup world, how many times have you and I both heard a person that says, "Oh, I had that idea once," or, "Oh, I wish I would start a business." And there's a difference between saying it and doing it, right? And I think a lot of people, it's either the risk or it's the fear of the unknown. I mean, whatever it might be that prevents them from starting. So, talk a little bit about, taking that leap of faith and getting a business started, especially with what you're doing, which is really, I mean, one of a kind, right? It's not like, you're recreating Walmart here and you have this perfect blueprint. You're kind of, doing a whole brand new idea.
yeah, the taking the step, or the leap, or the plunge, maybe that's a better, maybe it's plunge. I think for me it was a couple things. And I even, like with my nephew, I mentioned I was kind of coaching up and
Yeah.
talking about like life and where it goes. Um, and just trying to help him think about like what he wants to do, college and all those things. I think one of the pieces of advice I give to anybody early in their career is just get into something and learn it and do it really, really, really well, right? Um, because you're gaining such a tool set as you do that over the course of time. And then I think the other piece of advice is be patient, right? Like just be
Yeah.
patient and allow yourself, like somebody who's an achiever mindset, it's hard to be patient because you're like, well, I want to be making this or whatever, and I want to do it tomorrow, right? And that's
Yeah.
just an unrealistic expectation. And so I think for me, at 26, I made the commitment like, okay, I'm getting into the independent insurance brokerage world, and I'm committed to it. So I'm gonna stick with it. I'm not giving up. I'm gonna be patient. And what that allowed me then with the startup was to gain an education on an industry that I think was well established for some change, some automations, innovation, disruption, whatever you want to call it. And I had all of that knowledge, that education of almost a decade in to kind of take in and inform how we approach that, how we did it. And I think that's very different than, hey, I'm a tech guy and I know how to code and I'm just gonna go try and disrupt the space without
Yeah.
knowing like the frequency of that space, right? So for me, it was a little bit easier because I had the knowledge and experience. And then I think the other thing that made it super easy is I had conviction. So
Right.
I felt like with my own customers at the independent brokerage, I wasn't giving them the best
Mm.
that was
Yeah.
out there. And that's because there wasn't anything out there. We needed to create something for them that got them into the 21st century and, not like 1985, like most of the insurance industry still operates. So for me, there was like a conviction component to it of like, hey, if I tell my clients I'm going to do everything I can to serve them well, like we kind of had to do it, in my opinion. Otherwise I wasn't going to be holding up that end of my end of the bargain on that. So I think those two things, like the time, the experience, and then the conviction component made it easier for me to make the plunge because I'm like, you know what, like it's the right thing to do. There's definitely like some kind of altruism in that initial
Yeah.
decision of like, no, you got to do it. And then it's like, oh my gosh, we're gonna do it. What the heck are we gonna do? Like, how are we gonna accomplish this? And then you
Yeah.
got like a whole nother set of like after you've kind of made that decision, how do we get from A to B? Which is a whole nother dynamic.
Yeah. So there's a couple points I want to highlight in that, and I'll just start with the last one first, and then we'll work our way back. But the first one is, I think for so many people, exactly what you're saying is right. You're sitting there and you're like, I need to have all the answers before I can really start. And the problem is that anything you're going to start, you want to be calculated, but at the same token, until you get user feedback or until you get customer feedback, you're not going to have all the right answers anyway. So don't wait until you think it's perfect. Go to market and then get feedback from the people that are actually going to be a potential customer or a client, right? So talk a little bit about that from your guys' standpoint of, hey, we were calculated, we had insider info, but we still had to start somewhere and then take feedback to get it to where it's progressing to today.
Yeah, I think that's like easily the most important, powerful part of the experience is you have to have enough confidence to go, right?
Yeah.
But enough humility to
Mhm.
pivot, right?
Yeah.
Along the way, enough humility to say, you know what, we thought it was this, but actually it's we're 3 degrees off, it's this.
Yeah.
And make those adjustments. And that's hard when you're like attached to something, right? But what
Right.
becomes powerful in that process, and we were fortunate, we got plugged into the Omaha Startup Collaborative, who just kind of incubated us, like coached us through, hey, how do we get from A to B to C? And a big part of that is, yeah, that customer feedback component. Hey, don't spend $10 million building something that nobody's used once. Spend
Yeah.
$5,000, get a piece of it in front of them, and ask them, hey, are we on the right track? Get that feedback. Make your pivots and adjust and keep, kind of keep going. And so that was certainly our progression was, let's start small, right? Work big, iterative approach to the whole process. And it served us well so far. And it's going to continue to be that way in perpetuity, right? Like we're always getting feedback of, hey, could you tweak this? We didn't love how this worked, or hey, we loved this. Could you do more of it? And that
Yeah.
feedback becomes super, super powerful. And it doesn't matter if that's in technology like we are, or if that's construction or anything, right? Like that I think Dan Allison, feedback marketing, right? Like it's
Yeah.
that same thing, right? Like it doesn't matter the industry, go get feedback. That's going to make you better. And if you're willing to get better, listen, you're going to do just fine.
Yeah. I love that. That's really good. Now, the second thing that I want to highlight was when you just made the comment, hey, I made the decision to join your code, to enter into the insurance space, and like I wanted to be focused on that. And I think it correlates really well to what you're talking about earlier when you said, hey, don't get the shiny object investment syndrome, right? And I think what happens for a lot of people is they say, well, I'm going to start here, but if it doesn't work out in the next 3, 4, 5 months, like I'm open to something else. And inherently, there's no problem with making pivots, like you just mentioned. At the same token, if you're not all in, it's really hard on that one day where just everything goes wrong to stay committed to seeing what's possible. And so, I think it's, having all right, I'm going to give this a year, right? And if after the year, it's just not what I thought it was, or it's not going the way, cool, then I will transition. But it's not a constant, revolving door of like, if something else comes through, maybe I'll just, take that and run with it for a little while. So talk about, the idea of having a commitment to something, because that's going to let you see it through even on the tough days. And at the same token, to your point, being willing to pivot if you find out, hey, this isn't the right thing.
Yeah, it's my wife. So really what you're learning here is she's like actually the one you should be having the podcast with, because I just regurgitate everything she gives me. But she often uses this phrase, it's all about balance. And what she means by that is body, mind, soul, work, play, family, faith, all those things, right? There's got to be some equal weighting to all of those as you go through life. And I think the commitment is the first step, right? But weighting that with all those other components of, hey, if I get a year out and I'm just miserable, my faith, my family, all those things are way out of skew because I'm doing this thing and I did commit to it, which is good. But having the ability to look at the rest of your kind of ecosystem, if you will, as a person and say, you know what, like, but it has thrown all of this out of whack for me. It is time for a pivot, right? So I think it just takes thoughtfulness and awareness around like, what's good for you as a person. I think balance is hard no matter what, right? Like we live in a hyper fast paced environment, especially here in the States, and like, like people are like, it's like a badge of honor to be like, hey, I worked 100 hours this week, right? And to me, like, sure, yeah, like great work ethic, but also like what other portions of your life are now way out of whack, right? Like we're just not meant to only do that, right? And the talk about like compounding effect of like stress over time, right? Like that's also not a good thing, right? Like you gotta get some rest and mentally, emotionally, spiritually, or whatever. So I think for me, it commitment is always weighted with how is this impacting the other pieces of my life, the ticker on the bus that are super important to me, and is it supporting all of that, or is it massively impacting all that in a negative way? And that's how I kind of like, that's sort of the litmus I run it through personally, just to see. And so even like with the startup stuff, there are days where I'm like, wow, other portions of life are way out of whack. And then it's like adjusting the dial, right? Okay, like how do I recalibrate this to kind of make it all work for now, understanding that everything's for a season, right? Like I'm only going to be in startup world for a period of time, right? It's eventually it can't be a startup. I don't know what, like how many years in it's not a startup, but eventually you can no longer call it a startup, I'm pretty sure. So so understanding, hey, for a season, like I may be out of whack a little bit here, so I'm trying to recalibrate and adjust for it. that's, those are all things that like each individual person, like it's different and their thresholds are different and what's important to them is different. Some guys like, hey, work is it and they don't care about anything else. That's not me. Like I really
Yep.
care about my family. I really care about spending time there and investing time there. So I'm going to adjust and make sure that that's still a focus and a priority for me.
Absolutely. Well, so to tie it all together then from a first comment to now, I think an interesting dynamic as a parent, I'm sure you're finding, I myself am not a parent, but I think about it frequently and it's like, that would be a tough balancing act. And that is, you talked about the work ethic that was instilled in you and, certain ways that was done. And obviously your world is a bit different, right? You can't say, hey, I need you to go, sweep out the barn for, 4 hours a day. Like that's just not the job that's going to be done. But I think the other dynamic is every parent aspires to give their children more than what they ever had. And so it's kind of that balancing act of like, how do I give them more, but make them appreciate it equally as much, if not more, and understand what it's taken to have that opportunity. So, I know for you, you said, hey, it's not easy, but, any words of wisdom to someone listening that's like, man, I'm trying to, instill this in my kiddos. What can I be doing?
Man, I'm not sure I've got the code cracked on that one, to be honest. Here's what I will say. Uh, it, I read a little bit, right? So I
Yeah.
put out some books and some different things. The love languages I find really fascinating. If you've never done it, should do it. Whether it's for a spouse, girlfriend, a parent, a kid, it doesn't matter. It applies. And I think just understanding, kind of like how your kids mentally engage and respond is really important, because with each kid, I just had a conversation with my oldest last night at bedtime. We kind of do our devotions and tuck in or whatever, and we had a conversation. I said, what are you passionate about right now?
Yeah.
I'm curious, right? She's 13. I'm like, what are you passionate about right now? We have these conversations all the time, and she gave me her answer, right? And I'm like, okay, like there's two things she said. I'm like, okay, so how do I support you in those, right?
Yeah.
And starting to instill that, hey, if you're passionate about this thing and you want to go do that thing, what's it going to take for you to do that and do it very successfully? And
Mm.
so for me, at least today, it's conversational,
Yeah.
because of our environment. Whereas, when I was a kid, it was like, get your butt outside and shovel, some, what
Yeah.
in the feedlot. Cause like you're not getting dinner if you don't, it's not quite that dynamic in our house. So I try and approach it in from a little bit more of like a conversational, like self-advocation sort of approach. Like I want
Mhm.
them to advocate for themselves. Like, you want something, tell me what that is. And then I'm going to help you build the framework, right? The path to go get that thing. So that's how we approach it. I don't know that that is gonna yield great results. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see in about 10 years, I guess.
I love it. I love it. Well, Chris, are there any other, pivotal moments that you want to make sure to highlight that have been so far on this journey?
Hey man, I don't think so. I appreciate the opportunity to have the discussion. Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely. Ask away, brother.
All right, man. So just tell me about your desire, your start doing a podcast. What kind of like the motivation, what got you going, and how that all. I'm curious. Just tell me a little bit about it.
Yeah. So, kind of funny story. So, I take in a lot of content. Like, I love to read, I love to listen to things. And my friends would always say, gosh, why don't you just do it yourself? And just like everyone else, is like, because I already have a million and one things, between the financial planning practice, between the rental real estate business I run, it's like I got more than enough stuff going on. The last thing I need is another thing, on the docket. And anyway, it was COVID of 2020. And every November, I take like a 5-day getaway to set my goals for the next year. And I like doing it in November because it motivates me to finish the year strong for December. And it gives me enough time to make sure like that's what's important. So
Love it.
I invite two of my best friends, Jason and his wife, Rebecca, out to Colorado with me. I got in a cabin and I said, hey, during the day, I'm going to be off the grid, but at night, it'd be fun to, have cocktails and dinner and whatnot. Well, anyway, we're driving out there and I'm just asking Jason a bunch of questions as we drive, and his wife in the back seat goes, "The way you ask questions is kind of interesting. Like, have you ever thought about having a podcast?" And I was like, "Well, I have thought of it. I'm going to set my goals. Like, I should probably just do the darn thing." And so that was the idea. Well, simultaneously, I was reading this book at the time, and it's called The Power of Moments. And it's a little bit different than like what we're talking about, but it's why we remember certain things and why we don't remember other things.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I was like, well, I love people's stories. I would be super intrigued to know like what moments, have been impactful for them. And so that kind of gave me the idea. And so I had my goal the first year was to have 10 episodes. I figured, hey, like one a month ish. Yeah, that'll be good. And I recorded like the 8th one, and the guy was like, "When's this going to come out?" And I said, "I'll probably release in like September." And he goes, "Just delete it. Don't worry about using it." I was like, "What? What do you mean?" And he goes, "Well, I don't want to wait that long to get the content. So just delete the interview and like, you can have someone else." I was like, crap. So I was like, well, I need to get these out quicker. So I started to do one a week, or one every other week. And I moved to one a week and then 2 a week. And yeah, it's just kind of grown. I think last week's episode was episode like 233 or something like that. So
Wow. Love it, man. So talk about commitment right there, right? That's awesome. I love hearing that. So, all right, so that's my takeaway from today is there's still room to put some content out there, which is good. And I appreciate you doing it, man, and thanks for indulging my question. I was curious to know kind of the startup there. So glad to hear it.
absolutely. Well, thanks for sharing your story, my man.
Hey, pleasure anytime, brother.